Happy Wednesday, folks. We got an email from a viewer, Jonathan K, who says, I watched your quoting video and I definitely feel more comfortable quoting job shop work. I'm just getting started though, and I don't have a big collection of end mills, taps, and tools, etc. Do I just have to soak up that cost until I build up my inventory, or how do you think about that as I'm getting started? So, Jonathan, we were in your shoes when we got started 10 years ago and did job shop work for about 10 years, starting out with just our single Tormach in a garage, and proud to say have grown a fair amount. And we don't do job shop work anymore, but we actually still do a fair amount of custom fixture plates. So we do still have to think about some of these tooling type of questions. So here are a couple of things to think about or consider, whether you're bidding a job shop job or any other work where you've got to think about how much do I want to amortize the cost of a specific tool or some other sort of capital expenditure, or even frankly the setup time or complexity of programming a part, those sorts of things to chew on. To answer your question, Jonathan, most directly, yes. If you're just getting started and you need taps or end mills, that's the stuff that you need to come out of pocket for, and is not the type of thing where you're going to be able to pass that along to a customer when you quote a job. Now, when you quote a job, you're not including how you came up with all the details of those costs. So for sure, you're able to make some profit and able to reinvest that back into the shop to add to your tooling repertoire. Awesome stuff. But we've gotten this question before with this idea of, hey, if I need to spend $100 or $300 on a custom tool, how do you treat that in a quote? And I've never been a big fan of the answer, it depends. So let's give some scenarios. The best thing that I like to think about is taking these examples to the extreme, because it helps you clarify, and everyone will then be able to relate and understand. So one extreme would be kind of like the Jonathan question. If the tool you need for the quote this job is the CNC machine, well, of course you can't include that in the cost. That's something you just are supposed to have to be able to bid on this kind of work. Similarly, on the far other side, if it's some crazy custom job that requires a $1,000 form cutter that's profiled only for this customer and it'll never get used again, every customer is going to realize that that's something that has to get baked into the overall relationship, the quote, the PO, or however you're bidding the work. And that really speaks to the question that you should be thinking about when you're quoting work like this, is the same thing we talked about in our quoting video. What's it worth to the customer? Another way of phrasing that is, what's their next best option? If they can go to another shop and that shop already has that tool sitting around and then can bid the job more aggressively, that's your competition there. But like we talked about in that quoting video, you need to know what your costs are and how much it costs you to produce the part, not only the raw material, but the time, the tooling, and so forth. But then set that number aside and try to figure out what it's worth to the customer. And of course, there's probably going to be a relationship between those two, especially the more commodity or simple the part is to do. That means the more shops would be able to bid on it, and it kind of becomes a pretty efficient or competitive product. But when it comes to custom tooling, most shops understand that somehow that has to get baked into the price. The other way to think about quoting this kind of thing is, do you want the job? Now, if you're slow right now or you're really looking to grow your book of business, you probably want to get that job. That's great. But again, take it to the extreme. Do you want to do 20 of these types of jobs a month or 500 of these types of jobs a year, where you're always thinking about adding on new custom tooling? You might be up for that. It might make you get more creative or more build out your tool library. But again, pushing it to those extremes, I think, helps think about what's your good reaction. Are you just doing this job because you want to pull some cash in, get your feet wet, get a job under your belt? Which I did that for sure back in my New York days in the garage, and it actually felt great. And the profits we made off job shop work honestly helped us get, grow the business and ultimately get here. I did not find it easy at all, though, to build up custom tools or tools that were super unusual and keep them in a manner stored and able to be accessed in a database to understand on a future job, do I happen to already have a tool like that? I'll actually walk down here because I have one that just popped into mind. What I mean by that is, and you might be different if you're a really dialed in, really good job shop and you've a software database with tooling, you might be able to tackle this. But like, we had a job we did with one of these Harvey lollipop tools, and these are pretty expensive, pretty unusual custom tools that can do an undercutting. That's a good example of a tool where buying a $100, $200 tool for a job that's maybe only $1,000, a couple $1,000, you really got to think about how the customer is going to tolerate including that cost, and or are there other options? So one option is the customer buys the tool, provides it to you while you use it, and then you send the tool back to them when the job is done. That's actually a great way. It keeps you from having to buy the tool, tie up the working capital, and then be left with a tool that may not be worth that much to you. Otherwise, I found that cutting tools and other custom type stuff like that, fixtures and so forth, really doesn't have very much residual value. Meaning, I've never found an efficient way to take a tool like that costs, say, make it up $100. There's no way to sell it for even $70. So where you could recoup a good portion of your cost and only thinking about having to recover that delta, that $30 in the job work itself. One of the more common custom requirements that I've seen over the years was the need for a longer tool or more reach. And instead of always thinking you need to go buy a new piece of carbide, a really long flute length or extended reach tool, consider the ER16 style extensions. I know Mari Tool sells them. I think AB Tool sells them as well. And what I love about this is that they're not cheap, but that has got huge residual value to me as a machine shop, because a ton of places I can think about using that in the future, whether it's to reach a deep pocket with a 1/8 inch end mill, or switch it over to a 1024 tap for a deep pocket and a tap. So there are lots of ways to get creative without feeling like you always just have to go for the best solution like a new long tool. Now, one thing that is interesting is don't discount the residual value on overall jobs. Frank Mari, who owns Mari Tool now, he had shared an Instagram story probably a couple of years ago at this point, where he used to run I think it was a hydromat. So these are ultra high production, multi-spindle, I think of them as turning centers, but they could do machining as well. You're talking about making 1 million parts of something on it. And it was a brass part, and you're buying out a round bar. And if you cut up the round bar into the part length, the material cost per part was like 52 cents. And they won the job bidding it at, I want to say it was like 37 cents or 44 cents or something, which was kind of one of these whoa moments where you're like, wait a minute here. The material costs you 52 cents and you just bid the job for less than the material cost while you're using probably $1 million machine to make 1 million of these parts. And the answer was, anybody know the answer? The residual value of the scrap. Now, brass happens to have a really high scrap value, and they were removing a lot of the material. So it's a good example of thinking like, hey, you can get creative with how you bid a job, and when you're done with it, can you get rid of that job? Can you sell the material? We can get decent scrap value for plate work, like aluminum plates that are left over. The value out of regular aluminum or steel turnings or chips isn't that much. But hat off to you, Frank, for having the ingenuity to realize, although that sort of work scares the bejesus out of me. The other way to get creative is, do you need the tool? With modern CNC machines, there's so many tricks to get around needing what you might have thought of was a custom tool. There are so many features that you can interpolate instead of having custom tooling or custom sized drills. You can surface things in at the expense of more complicated or expensive form type tools, or tools like radii or ball mills that you may not have. And those things take more time, but okay, so what? You could do the job, make a little bit of money, and if the work continues to come back, you can choose internally how much you want to trade off. Hey, I want to buy this tool for $45 and it'll save 10 minutes off. It's a lot easier to make those decisions once you've got a job, you've got some parts successfully made off to the customer, and you can kind of weigh the trade-offs. As an example, we're not doing things on this machine right now that would speed it up, because it doesn't need sped up. Most of the time it runs until 10 p.m., 11 p.m. at night. It'll go a little bit longer as we add some more tombstones online, but it's not worth it to me to have things happen quicker or faster because it's got plenty of excess capacity right now. I expect that will change, and at that point in time, we'll add, here it's not even so much the cost of custom tooling, but rather the fact that everything's expensive on this thing. So to add, it has a 218 tool matrix, which is great, but every pull stud is, I think, $50 to $70. A holder might be $200. So you've got a fair amount of money tied up in tool holders that I don't necessarily want to do right out of the gate, but I'm cash flowing that over time. To wrap this up though, the last point I would say goes back to this quoting process of how you're presenting your quote, and number two, the customer. Number one, again, watch that quoting video. It's really about what you think it's worth to the customer. And generally speaking, I wouldn't involve them in most of the conversations where you're talking about your own inadequacies, or rather a tool you may not have. Again, unless it's something that's super custom, where of course that's going to be part of the conversation. Really what I would do is encourage you to think about what you're selling. When you're quoting a job shop job, or at least when we were doing it in the days, we weren't just selling the part that got put in the box, we were selling the solution to the customer. So toward the end of our job shop days, we had 3 or 4 customers who they were actually pretty upset that we were going to say, hard stop, we're moving full-time into Saunders Machine Works products. And look, I'll be totally honest. First off, I love what I do, and I'm very proud of everything that we've built. I'm not the world's best machinist. We could machine great parts, and we could make sure the parts were adequate or more than adequate for the customer, but I'm not God's gift to machining. But we still built a successful business running a job shop and making parts, which is awesome. And for those customers, I wasn't just selling the piece of aluminum that went in the box. I was selling them the Saunders solution. This person, call him Jason, knew he could send a part our way and that we would quote it. We would be, kind of the joke about the 3 things. You can have it quick, quick, cheap, or accurate? Pick 2 of the 3. You didn't actually usually have to be the cheapest option, but, and we weren't even actually always the quickest. We were usually pretty quick. What we did well though was we always communicated. We were always fair. We were always thorough. And they just knew that it was easy to work with. So we were kind of selling them this like low stress. Anyone who's watching our channel knows how frustrating it can be in some of the stories we've shared over the years of dealing with vendors who don't seem to be hungry for business, good at communicating, good at customer service. Frankly, the bar feels quite low in terms of being a solution provider. As a small machine shop, building a book of business with customers where you just give them solutions. You give them the parts that they want on time or ahead of time. You communicate, they're good quality. If you make a mistake, you make it right. Sometimes the recipe isn't any more complicated than that. So in a sort of theoretical, if we were doing job shop for a local big factory that needed some repair parts made, if there was a custom tool that I knew I wasn't going to reuse, I would just bake that tool into the price of the quote. And especially if it was a company that I've been dealing with for a while, and they're kind of thinking about us as just a solution provider, I don't think they'd balk for 1 second at the price. And if they came back and said, hey, Saunders, you're like 30% higher than the next guy on this, I would probably say, hey, this is this Delrin piece you guys need this crazy thing on. I got to buy a form tool. If you don't want me to do that, or you want to handle it a different way, but we'd probably get the chance to have that conversation, take a look at the numbers again, and so forth, which to me, that's part of what it's all about. Like that's one of the things I love doing. Frankly, I kind of missed the job shop work because of how cool it was to deal with new parts, new problems, ways to think about it. Made it really fun. But building those relationships over time usually gives you the chance to have that conversation, but I would never burden with them usually out the door. So as always, folks, if you guys have advice or things I'm missing or your own perspective, I actually would genuinely love to hear them in the comments. Otherwise, hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed. Take care. See you soon.